Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event on building a sustainable and competitive battery raw materials industry in Europe. Welcome to all of you here in the room and also those of you joining online. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based here in Brussels. I'm going to be guiding us through our talk today, which is really about the building blocks that are necessary to meet the EU's ambitious climate targets. So we know that in its 2019 Green Deal, the EU emphasized the importance of domestic electric battery production to achieve the energy transition while fostering a competitive and sustainable battery value chain. The goal is to scale up domestic EV battery production and establish a fully integrated value chain within the EU. But while significant progress has been made, the reality today shows that the EU is still far from fully achieving these objectives. Now, in the 2024 Draghi Report on European competitiveness, the European Commission was advised to improve some of these issues, particularly its raw materials supply chain, for which it's dependent on other areas of the world for a lot of materials. Now, that was followed by the Competitiveness Compass early this year, and it really highlighted how sustainable growth needs to be accompanied by secure value chains and making sure that Europe is as self-sufficient as possible for the tools needed for the energy transition. So some of the concerns that were raised in the Draghi Report were slower productivity growth compared to other regions and the disruptive impact of emerging technologies. But it identified 3 areas for action: closing the innovation gap, advancing a competitive decarbonisation strategy, and enhancing security by reducing external dependencies. So in today's panel, we're going to talk about how all of this context applies to the race for raw materials to build batteries needed for electric vehicles. What's the current state of industries supplying critical raw materials such as cobalt, lithium, and nickel for the EV battery value chain? And is the Commission's Competitiveness Compass effectively addressing the industry's concern? Let me introduce you to the panelists we have with us here today to discuss these issues. We have Daniel Kjost, who is a policy officer for energy-intensive industry and raw materials at the European Commission's DG GROW department. We have Julia Polskanova, who is Senior Director for Vehicles and E-Mobility Supply Chains at the NGO Transport and Environment. We have Mark Mistry, who is the Director of Public Policy and Sustainability at the Nickel Institute. And then joining us online at 1 p.m., we're going to have the Italian MEP Benedetta Scuderi and the Belgian MEP Sarah Matthew joining us. They are both members of the European Parliament's Industry and Energy Committee, and they're both from the Green Group. Now, you're going to be able to ask your questions to the panelists using Slido, whether you're here with us in the room or joining us online. You can see the QR code that's just popped up there. So if you're in the room, you can scan that QR code with your phone, and you can type in the questions that you have for the panelists. If you already know your question, feel free to put it in now. I'll see it on my tablet up here. It's very helpful for me to know some of the audience questions in advance so I can queue up the panelists to answer your questions as best as possible. So Daniel, let me start by asking you, so I mentioned some of the Commission strategy there and how this comes in the context of concerns about the competitiveness of Europe. So when it comes to raw materials, does the EU right now have a secure enough raw material supply to meet its transport decarbonization goals, which are heavily reliant on electrification of transport? And what policy could improve this situation?
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a big pleasure to address you. Actually, I have a big background in this topic because I'm working in the Commission in this unit dealing with raw materials since 2018. So actually, I can give you a wider perspective. You mentioned the Green Deal and the objectives of batteries and raw materials. Actually, we started in 2018 before with the Battery Action Plan, highlighting that building an EU battery value chain is not just cell production, but it's going from the beginning from raw materials. And this is where we started. This was the starting point here. And this links to the questions, where are we now with raw materials? Because at that time we did a profound analysis with the member states, what raw materials we are producing in Europe, what raw materials are in Europe in terms of deposits. And we came into a conclusion that there's a lot of deposits in the EU that potentially could be developed, and that some of them were developed at that time. But at the same time, we found that even if we get mining happening in Europe, we had no processing capacity, for instance, for lithium. Yeah? So on the one side, we were taking measures to create extraction in Europe or to support this. But at the same time, we realized if we don't support also the processing, the refining, then we will still need to rely on third countries on the processing side. And now we are in a moment today where the Commission has adopted 60 strategic projects under the Critical Raw Materials Act, 47 in the EU, 13 outside of the EU in third countries. And out of these projects, we have 22 projects dealing with lithium, 12 on nickel, 10 on cobalt, 7 on manganese, and I think 11 on graphite. And out of that, we have 8 projects dealing with processing of lithium. So we have moved during these years to the moment that we have several companies really investing in this capacity with the EU support under the Critical Raw Materials Act. These projects are able to get the permitting periods as envisaged in the Act, so 27 months for the extraction projects and 15 months for processing and recycling. So these are the measures the Commission took. The Act came into force last year. And now we are working further on implementing. The biggest deliverable we had during this year, the first year of implementation, was this first year for strategic projects. And now we will be continuing these next rounds of applications, but also dealing with other measures such as national exploration programs, for instance. So there's a lot to do in terms of policy and implementation of the Act. So this is our first priority when it comes to raw materials policy.
And we'll come back to the Critical Raw Materials Act a bit in the discussion. Julia, obviously T&E has identified electrification of transport as one of the key avenues for decarbonizing transport and meeting the EU's overall decarbonization goals. So in your view, how important is raw material supply to the EU actually meeting these goals?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks a lot, and really good to see everyone. In fact, I was here, I think I was even in the same chair, about 2 years ago with your colleague Peter Handley at the time, and we were debating actually the Critical Materials Act as it was being planned, right? And now we kind of 2 years down the line, we have Critical Raw Materials Act. I think the one I would probably like to share is that I think we lost some of the zeal in this and some of the I think there was a lot of prioritization on critical raw materials a few years ago, and it feels like some of it has been lost, and it would be good, maybe it's the change of the Commission, but the momentum is no longer there, and it would be good to get some of this back. But let me, of course, also, I'll answer your question as well. I mean, more broadly, we see and we believe that it's not just electrification of transport, but generally, as we go to the all sorts of the energy transition, be it renewables, be it green hydrogen, or be it electric vehicles, the clean tech that powers it relies on some of those critical minerals. And I think everyone understands that, but I think what people then jump on is to say, well, this is why it's all so bad, we'll have more mining, we're going into more mining. Actually, the largest mining today is coal. This is the largest extraction in the world. Phasing out fossil fuels is great to reduce mining. Second largest, I think, iron and then gold. So yes, we will need these critical materials. They're just different from the critical or from the kind of mining elements we've had in the past, but nonetheless, we will actually require less, not more. We just need to focus there. In my view, I will maybe mention just 3 points about the current framework to secure those minerals. First and foremost, I do believe that the Critical Raw Materials Act, as agreed, is a really, really great framework. I was even in a meeting last year now in Canada, and I think we all know Canada as a mining jurisdiction, and Canadians, people from the Canadian government were saying to me, Julia, we love, the strategic projects in the CRMA, such a great, requirement, we're going to repeat something like that. So the ideas in CRMA are very good. So strategic projects is exactly the way to go. You select them and you really speed that up so that they happen. Permitting, I think, is a great compromise where we are going faster, but we're not compromising on any of the environmental social safeguards, etc., etc. But as I said, we lost some of that momentum in implementing. And for me, the 2 things that I would broadly outline, and hopefully we'll have more time to talk about them in the panel, that I think are missing. So number 1 is just the actual implementation of the objectives of the Critical Raw Materials Act, so it delivers the supply of sustainable raw materials in Europe. It's great that we have selected strategic projects. We're one of the few NGOs that welcomed the fact that the Commission selected the strategic projects, but it's not even the beginning of the job. The real job is not selecting. The real job is then working with all of these projects to get them off the ground, to secure finance, for example. And this hasn't happened. In fact, I've been talking to a number of companies who have been selected, and all they say, we're not sure what is happening now, right? So the real job is to get the projects, not to get the selection of them. And especially now on what's happening with rare earths, for example, in China, we actually have quite a few projects there on the list on rare earths. Why don't we just roll up the sleeves and rush to actually make them happen? And that's what maybe I see missing. So that momentum in implementation and all enabling conditions, notably finance. The second thing which I think is missing and where we have been, in my view, a little bit weaker is generally on the global agenda. We do have a lot of frameworks. We have strategic partnerships, we have the MSP Forum, now we also have Clean Investment and Trade Partnerships, CITIP, so there's a lot of potential good opportunities actually. But what they are not delivering today is either actual projects on the ground, so either we're actually working on something, be it in Argentina or Zambia, to bring that mine on board with offtake to Europe. That's not happening. Or even just being really smart about building those diplomatic relations with key countries. There's a number of allies in this world, and we've all talked about it for years now. I don't know, be it Chile, be it Argentina, be it Australia. How can we take that cooperation to the next level so it goes beyond memorandums of understanding to real action, to real partnerships, to real projects? And I think that's for me really missing. What I perceive is that, and obviously I don't want to comment on what Trump wants to do, but what I perceive is that we as Europeans studied earlier on this global agenda. Americans studied a lot later, but they're already ahead of us. They're already, actually a bit like not completely as Chinese, but a bit closer to the Chinese, doing projects, buying resources, etc. And we're still having memorandums of understanding. So that maybe would be something else I would flag.
Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to come back to, I think. Mark, let's turn to you next. So the interesting thing about nickel and raw materials in general is that when it comes to electric vehicles, they're both at the start and the end of an electric vehicle's life cycle because they're used to construct the battery, and then also you need to do the mining of existing raw materials to hopefully recycle and use in another battery, hopefully. So what challenges would you say the sector is facing on both ends of that EV life cycle?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, first of all, to link it back to Daniel and Julia, when we look into the Critical Raw Materials Act, we are talking about 3 pillars. One is enhancing domestic production. That's actually on the mining side. We are talking about recycling, that we have to ensure that everything we put these days on the markets, once the batteries, as an example, reach the end of their life, enter recycling schemes and are efficiently recycled. And the third dimension is coming back to Julia, which is raw materials diplomacy. So we need to ensure that we are supplied with raw materials, given the fact that in some cases, if I take the example of nickel, we will not be able to satisfy the growing demand, especially for EV batteries, with the nickel that we can mine or recycle in the European Union. And therefore, our industry is actually quite active on the mining side. Our companies are right now either already active on the recycling side or are investing into recycling. And I think when I look right now into the Competitiveness Compass, into the Draghi Report, the Critical Raw Materials Act, the batteries regulation, and I think, most of the points were already mentioned. There are many, many positive elements contained. So we are talking about, for example, the strategic projects. We are talking about access to sustainable finance. We are talking about improving permitting. There may be, just for your understanding, it was something I mentioned to Daniel earlier today. When we look into Indonesia, which is currently the main nickel-producing region globally, the time between the first exploration and the first ton of nickel product being placed on the market is down to 2 years. We are, in the Western world, still at 10 to 12 years. Yeah, so the issue was identified and is addressed by the European Commission. That is good. But what we are missing is the reality check. And the reality check is to talk to companies and to learn what are the issues that companies are facing. And what we very often hear back from companies is actually regulatory incoherence. It is important to understand when you talk about the metals industry, you're talking about a sector that is very capital intensive. So we are talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions, that you have to invest to establish a mine or to update your process technologies. And that means that you need to have planning security. So policy coherence, knowing what actually the framework conditions are and that they are not changing, is for us critical. And that is a point that we see again and again not being respected. And that leads to problems. I can give one example, which is maybe something that sounds very technical. It's about so-called environmental quality standards. So how much can be emitted from sites that are producing nickel or using nickel. And we see values being defined which are extremely low. And that means that there are massive costs arising for the industry. And the character of our industry is we are a global industry, so we cannot pass on these costs. And it is impacting, of course, the domestic production as well as the recycling of these raw materials.
Yeah, we'll come back. Obviously, there's two places where the raw materials can come from, extraction and recycling, and we can talk about the merits of each and kind of the need for each. But Daniel, I wanted to put to you Julia's point there that when the Critical Raw Materials Act came out, there was a lot of attention, I think, to this issue. I certainly recall as well that there was like this big push of energy. Would you agree with Julia that the energy there has maybe dissipated a bit now that the CRMA is in force, and maybe there's a feeling that, okay, the act has been passed and we can relax now. And in particular, this point, which is interesting, that the EU got started with identifying this as a critical area earlier than the US, and yet the US seems to be surpassing it right now in terms of some of the agreements.
Well, I will start with saying that we haven't lost any energy in the Commission. I think we're devoted as much as we were before, or even more. It is really hard work to implement the Act and the projects, select them, and now follow up their development. So I think we are very much committed to continue this with the support of the stakeholders and the member states. So this is the first point. I think now it was also a learning by doing with the first round of strategic projects, first selecting them, now their implementation. So we see actually after the first projects were selected that they gain a lot of attention in the media, in the discussions with the governments from those countries, also with the third countries as well. Many companies came to us saying that they got a lot more interest from financial institutions, from potential off-takers, suppliers, other business opportunities. So we see that this has really changed the discussion around raw materials projects. We also see a bigger interest from financial institutions to get familiarized, first of all, with projects in raw materials, to the strategic projects. And there are more and more institutions considering supporting raw materials projects. So this is a very tangible result of the strategic projects and all of the discussions. So really having these projects materialize, it's a game changer. And we are still at the beginning phase of this. We will see in a few years when these projects materialize. But as we go further with their implementation, we will see more and more different institutions getting more involved, changing the way they operate. The member states are implementing the single contact points for the applications. So they will also need to change the way they operate with permitting. But also, they will also discuss with us how we can further support these projects, not just with permitting, with financing, with off-takers. We announced this joint purchasing platform by the end of the year. So this is another instrument we are working on delivering to support market uptake and off-take agreements for these companies. So there's a lot to be done, and definitely a lot of energy needed to work on this.
And Julia, there's a lot of different pieces of legislation involved here. When it comes to taking full advantage of being able to recycle the existing materials in Europe, of course, we have the end-of-life vehicles regulation. How well do you think the existing policy framework is working in getting those raw materials back and being able to use them again?
So can I answer just part of your question? Because I really want to react also to what was, Daniel, what you were saying, because I think there's just, so we have quite a broad, consistent policy framework, but I do want to really zoom in on what I believe we are missing, actually, more broadly, not only about the end of life and recycling. So we have targets, objectives, benchmarks. So CRMA is very good in this for raw materials, and ZIA for clean tech, et cetera, et cetera. What we're really missing is a comprehensive toolbox of industrial policy measures to then actually get all those objectives done in the real world. What do I mean by that? And actually recycling is exactly the same, because it's also an industry that you need to scale and it faces same challenges. So it's not really your ELV or your CRMA, it's your industrial policy that will bring this industry and those facilities to recycle here. As long as you don't have recycle facilities, it will always go to China where you can recycle. So for me today, it's clear that what we don't have, whether you're building a battery factory, a refining facility for lithium, recycling facility, or a mine, somehow we don't have a business case in Europe, right? So the investor does not really see why in Europe, where it's significantly easier and all the expertise are, for example, in China, much faster to build mining in Indonesia, and in the US you get lots of subsidies. So with all of this, you're looking at Europe. Yes, you have benchmarks in CRMA. You're like, but why would I invest here? And that's what we need to unpack. Two things here I would mention that need to happen. Both of them have been mentioned in the Clean Industrial Deal, and also more specifically in the case of battery supply chain that I focus on in the Automotive Action Plan. These two things are moving towards supporting that ramp up or production aid, so financial support for companies that are scaling or ramping up in Europe. So we support companies at the research phase. We do have technology, by the way. I believe we have technology. We have great projects. Where we start failing is then we start manufacturing it at scale. The US was brilliant. That's exactly what they've done with the US IRA. They gave you that kind of per unit production subsidy. So as you're scaling, increasing your production, you're paid to help with that cost gap with China, so that cost gap can be helped with in the ramp-up phase by production aid. And yesterday was a big blow to that, because it was such a simple and actually easy opportunity to change the guidelines in state aid, in CSAF, to allow that production aid. And it didn't happen. We still can't do that, right? Even though we said in the Automotive Action Plan and Clean Industrial Deal, we look into that. So this is one thing that's missing. Because if I'm an investor, I come to Europe and I know that, just as a pure example, for each kilogram of lithium hydroxide produced, I will get, I don't know, €5. I know my costs, I've calculated it. It's so easy, I can do that. In Europe, it's project by project, behind closed doors, no one knows what comes out, impossible to make the investment. The second thing, which I think is even more relevant, especially for the midstream and mining industry, is to have more local content or made in EU requirements. Because what happens today, even when you do build your battery factory in Europe, and usually you would get subsidies and some support for that, you still then go to China, because that's where everything is. It's easier to source your materials, your machinery, your intermediary components. So what doesn't exist is that somehow pool to source it locally. But on the other hand, it's wrong to say that we don't have that. We have so many smaller companies, scale-up startups that are trying, as I think we all know very well, to do anodes, cathodes, everything. They can't get offtake with those battery factories, because indeed it's easier and cheaper and already established and commercial in China. I understand. So we need to break that circle, and that circle can be broken by stronger made in EU requirements. Again, we have it promised, we just need to do it. One opportunity here is IDA, Industrial Decarbonisation Accelerator Act, but we can't wait 3 years for that. It can't be done in such a long legislative time, and that would also send a similarly strong signal to investors. So if I do produce materials in Europe, I come to a private investor and I say, look, they will have to buy my stuff, because actually stuff have to be made here. There's local requirements. And I think that is another thing that can really help the business case. For me, these are the major two things lacking. And it's in exactly the same way transferable to recycling debate. We have targets. We have actually, I believe, quite good framework, for example, in the battery regulation already. What we don't have is a business case to scale recycling facility in Europe. And it's the same. You need that support so that actually it makes sense to do it here and not send it to China or South Korea.
Mark, do you share these concerns about some of these missing gaps? And in terms of the business case, if you're looking at China, where things can happen faster, the US, where you could maybe get IRA funding or tax breaks, what is the business case for Europe then?
I think, first of all, when it comes to China and recycling, indeed, China has a competitive advantage, simply out of the fact that these days, China is one of the most mature markets when it comes to EV batteries. So they are, the amounts available to recycle batteries. And what we need to ensure is that the materials that we actually put on the markets here in Europe stay within the European Union and are available for European recycling facilities. We see within our member companies that, as I said, they start preparing or they already are active in recycling. There are a number of projects that we accompanied where we were looking into when, in what quality and where materials are coming back from battery recycling. So I think the industry is preparing. And the other point, coming back to financing, what we also see, and that's a very important point, Julia, you mentioned the word sustainability. I think one of the key points when it comes to European raw materials production is that it is a quite sustainable industry. It's an industry that is working hard on its carbon footprint. It's an industry that is working on implementing ESG standards. And that is something that we see as a competitive advantage towards, for example, production elsewhere in the world. And we see these elements being picked up also by the investor community. So it's not only about, to make the maximum profit out of a project, but it's also to ensure that you steer your investments into a sector that you consider to be sustainable. Now, coming back to recycling, it's always the same story that we hear from our member companies, which is it costs a lot of money. you need to convince the investor that this investment that you have to take for the coming 15 to 20 years is safe. And there the question, of course, occurs, and that's a question that comes back in due diligence investigations. Is it safe or not? And there we are coming back to this point that we still see these inconsistencies, that we are not really basing regulation on the same principles, which would provide the planning security that companies require.
Well, let's turn to our two members of the European Parliament who have joined us remotely online. Benedetta Scuderi, if you're there. I'll start with a question for you. So we've been talking about all of the various pieces of EU legislation that are relevant here for this issue. And obviously the most directly relevant is the Critical Raw Materials Act. How do you assess the progress of the CRMA over the past 2 years in helping with the supply of these raw materials that are needed for electric vehicles? And what do you think might be needed or desirable in terms of further EU policy to help in this area?
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks. So thanks, first of all, sorry for joining late, and thank you so much for the invitation. So first of all, how are we going? So I think the Critical Raw Material Act, of course, was very much needed. At the moment, we also see a kind of like a harsh progress, especially for SMEs and for the complexity of what we are facing. And also, it's extremely important to understand how we can make our the demand, the internal demand, more competitive. How we can actually be able to produce and to create a manufacturing sector that is capable of absorbing the need of more raw material and sustainable raw material, and how we can make especially the circular economy sector more competitive in terms of being able to not replace, but like substitute some of the needs that we have for critical raw materials. So I think we need to see we need to gather this question on the different perspectives and on different aspects. First of all, how do we create more internal demand? One of the main issues that we have at the moment is that we are, even if we increase the access to critical raw material, we have a problem in actually manufacturing. And this is like for the battery, this is one of the main examples that we can have. We are struggling to have capacity of producing battery, or to compete with batteries coming from third countries like China, when the cost of batteries is around like 50% less than the cost of batteries in Europe. And this is making our battery industry incapable to survive. And on the top of that, we need to look at the whole value chain, how we can improve the value chain where battery are actually needed, where European battery are actually needed. So the first question we need to answer is how to increase internal demand and how to make our offer for the internal demand competitive without impacting negatively to end users' prices, because we don't want, of course, people to pay more for excessively more for goods, but we do want people to use goods that are more sustainable, that they are better sourced, they have better social conditions in terms of labor, and have better environmental conditions in production. And this is something that we need to find a balance. Some of the of course the expertise that we need to develop and the areas that we need to develop is how to create and support the creation of an internal value chain for actually having access for using the critical raw material and better resource critical raw material, and to make the critical raw material that we can provide and reach in a European and sustainable way more competitive. And for this, we need to look, of course, at public procurement. We need to look at supporting our internal manufacturing. We need to look at creating standards for and goods and value chains in order to allow our product to be more competitive, but also to allow all products to have better social and environmental conditions. And these, I think, are the main aspects that we need to look at when we try to tackle the critical raw material. And then finally, it's extremely important to support and push, even in the acts that we have in front of us, like the Clean Industrial Deal and the Circular Economy Act, to really push on circular economy. Circular economy is the sector where Europe can really make a difference, and when we can be more competitive, where we have some of the best expertise, and it's one of the sectors where we can really introduce our social and environmental standards to a high level. And that's why, like, one of the next steps now is to introduce circular economy in a transversal perspective, like to really have this as a primary source, as a primary focus for our industrial capacity, for our industrial strategy, for our critical raw material strategy, and understand how we can develop internally circularity, but also how we can make sure that raw materials and goods can stay in Europe in order to boost the circularity, internal circularity, and to get into the value chains. I think these are the main directive on which we need to work, and the next steps that we need to work on as European Parliament and European institutions.
Thanks, Benedetta. Sarah, let's turn to you next. How would you assess the progress of the CRMA? Also, when it comes to partnerships, one of the areas we were talking about before, Julia mentioned that the possibility of having partnerships with like-minded countries is maybe an area of low-hanging fruit that we haven't taken advantage of. So how would you assess the progress here?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me and for organizing the event. Well, you might know I was one of the ones on behalf of the Greens negotiating the Critical Raw Materials Act. Well, I think it's a bit early to say if we're really on track to achieve all of the 2030 benchmark objectives. But, well, if we take a glimpse, of course, based at what the Commission had published when it communicated quite recently the selected strategic projects, we can see when you look at lithium, for instance, well, if all projects would go ahead as planned, we would actually reach the recycling benchmark and even 80% of self-sufficiency when it comes to extraction. When you look at cobalt, we would actually surpass the recycling benchmark, but not for extraction and processing. And on rare earth, really only good news for processing. So all of that to just say that it's quite a mixed picture, I think. And in any case, these are all, of course, the best scenarios. It might occur that not all of these projects will make it. Although I also have to add, when I'm talking to the industry, that there are still quite some extra viable projects that didn't make it into the first batch, which is, of course, a shame. I think that there are still some things that can be ameliorated, also in the way companies are supported to actually file their cases. But indeed, I mean, for sure, we will have to continue also to rely on third countries. I think that makes the importance of the new clean trade and investment partnerships even more a priority in the short to medium term, of course. And, well, it will be key to get that right in the context of all the geopolitical rivalry that is going on. I do, however, before jumping into that, want to say that we also need to remember to do demand management because, well, there's a lot of focus on extraction. Yes, we will need more, but the question for me is really how many and what kind of impact is that going to have? And, well, that is to say that really also includes managing demand. I think one of the best examples there is mobility. if you invest in public transport, if you invest in shared e-mobility, that could really drastically moderate the increase of the demand. As you know, the CRMA actually contains a clause to develop a target for demand moderation. So I'm wondering if the Commission has actually worked on that yet. And I think what we also need to do is better design and collection for high quality recycling, for instance. I mean, I'm negotiating the end of life of vehicles. I'm taking that example because, of course, it's a massive sector. Number one, when it comes to aluminium, magnesium, platinum group metals, and a lot of rare earth, because right now cars are more and more becoming computers on wheels. So also for critical raw materials, I think it's really important to have these kind of new design requirements, dismantling requirements for certain components, actually introduce quality standards also for the treatment of the vehicles, because otherwise all these materials are just shredded together, which leads, of course, to a lot of contamination, to the loss of valuable materials. And if that's the case, then of course it's not economically viable to actually recover them. So I would want to see a focus there as well, not just on trade, but also really on demand reduction, quality of recycling, reuse, and remanufacturing. And when it comes to the clean trade and investment partnerships, I think it's really important that we get it right, that it's really a win-win, notably vis-à-vis the developing countries, where we can actually build coalitions to reduce our dependencies and have a more diverse input in our supply chains. But that also offers us, for instance, saying more added value processing, finance, transfer of tech to all of those trade partners. I think that's really the only way where we could actually beat global powers like the Chinese that don't care about standards, that don't care about the local communities, which is, of course, something we have seen at DRC, for instance. And I mean, that is very detrimental. So there, I would hope via the CTIPs, we could be more flexible, be more targeted, actually provide a lot of value and investments. So I'm really looking forward to see, for instance, what the TCIP with South Africa is actually going to look like once it materializes further, and hope that that is really a best practice we could build on.
Thanks, Sarah. So we've heard a lot of different policies. All the panelists have brought up the kind of myriad of different policies that are involved in this area. Daniel, obviously with a lot of policies comes a risk of siloed thinking, when different policies are the responsibility of different departments. How can we avoid siloed thinking when we're looking at this raw material supply issue? Would some kind of raw materials czar in the Commission coordinating this be helpful? How can we make sure that we are going in one direction here and not having contradictory policy?
Well, indeed, there are many policies contributing to raw materials, as mentioned, environmental, climate, industry, trade, research and innovation, finance. There's a lot of things to be combined. From the Commission's perspective, we cooperate with other DGs, other services when creating these policies, legislative proposals, also other instruments that we have possible. So, of course, we have coordination in-house on managing these initiatives. We jointly discuss. We have a common approach on this. So really, it's a joint effort from the Commission, from the services to address these issues. So we are working together on this. For instance, for the batteries, from the beginning, we took a value chain approach, and we went with many services, with DG RTD, Klima, Ener, Grow, with the SecGen as well. So really took here a very horizontal approach and try to continue that with joint efforts.
Mark, do you feel that there's a common approach here? And what do you think might help to maintain one vision here when we're looking at raw materials?
So maybe coming back to Daniel's comment, I think in theory, everything is in place to ensure that there's coherence in policy achieved. But in practice, we often enough see that various parts of the European Commission, but also of the other European institutions, are formulating targets which are not coherent, which are diverging. I think it's always good to give examples, and one of them is we have the REACH revision coming up. When we look into battery technologies, there's these days no battery technology without hazardous substances. And what we can see again and again being formulated is actually targets like we want a toxic-free environment. We want zero hazard. And that is not going to work. And this is what I mean when I talk about the need for policy coherence. There's a need to sit together and to take it serious and to say, listen, if we want to establish a full batteries value chain in the European Union, we have to accept that we are dealing with hazardous substances. But then look at, how can we find a common sense? And the common sense in this case would be, for example, risk-based approaches. So let's not look into the intrinsic properties of substances, but do they pose risks and can we manage those? And I think that is something that we still feel can be improved. As said, with, for example, the inter-service consultation, there are mechanisms in place that allow different DGs to look after proposals which are made, but more can be done. If you might allow, I would like to react on the comments made by the both parliamentarians regarding recycling, as I think recycling and the target set in the Critical Raw Materials Act, first of all, it is true, recycling bears a lot of potential. But we have to be aware the batteries that we place these days on the market are not going to be available for the coming 10, 12, 14 years. So it's a long-term target that we might achieve when we talk about the batteries we place on the market these days in 2035 or even later. And the second point regarding the targets which are set in the Critical Raw Materials Act for mining, processing, for recycling, I think it's a good starting point. But when I take the example of nickel, we are already achieving all these targets. So for nickel, they are meaningless. And it is important to take the next step, which is looking into raw materials specifically.
Benedetta, I know you have to leave shortly, so I want to get one more question into you. So on the subject of contradictory policy and targets. So right now we have the car CO2 targets a bit in flux at the moment. What impact do you think that has on the demand for electric vehicles, which obviously relates to the demand for electric vehicle batteries? And do you feel like, do you agree with Mark's point that there might be some contradictory policy going on here when we're trying to encourage electric vehicles with some legislation, then we have other legislation like the car CO2 targets being watered down? I believe. Benedetta, you are on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I don't think we can talk about contradiction. I do think, though, that if we started to completely deconstruct the structure of the Green Deal and the policies that we have made, we've taken in the last mandate in a not very linear and rational way, then we will end up into contradiction. What we should be doing at the moment is to understand what is going well and what is not going well, and how to improve what is not going going well. What we're actually doing, what we see from a push from certain groups in the parliament, sometimes also the commission with some proposal, is that we are just going to deconstruct and destroy some of the policies that we've taken, or completely water down some policies, change some targets. If we do this kind of maneuver without a proper rationale behind it, then we will end up into contradictions. Then we will end up into contradictory policies, but also into a very weird, impossible to follow path for the industry and for the investment. So what we actually need to do now, we want to have the target at 2035. We believe that is a target that is achievable. That is a target for automotive, of course, for transport. We believe that is a target that is achievable. We believe that is a target that could also support our industry if we get there in the right way. How we can get there in the right way? We need to understand which are the basic and the real problems beneath the demand for electric vehicles, the automotive crisis, the battery demand, and how we can tackle them. For this, we need to understand how we can increase the internal demand of electric vehicles, but also of electric vehicles that are actually produced in Europe, and now we can make the production in Europe more competitive. By, for example, abating energy prices, which is one of the main costs that now our producers and industry is facing. Also, supporting the industry or even asking the industry to start producing more economic, like cheap models and models that are more affordable for the population, to support the population to actually access electric vehicles in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of initial cost, to abate the scaling, like the economy of scales, and for the production in order to abate the costs and to make the vehicles to cost less, to use all the different tools we have to boost demand, which can be like company floats, which can be public procurement, which can be boosting a second-hand market through industry floats and other ways. And in this way, we create an internal demand, and we need to make sure that this internal demand is strongly connected with our internal production. And internal production, there needs to be fair, there needs to respect labor rights, there needs to respect environmental conditions, but also needs to actually be internal and not being outsourced and dislocated. And it needs to be supported by a value chain. And then we go into the understand how we can boost the production of the value chain, and that we can create partnerships that are not impacting negatively in our production and not impacting negatively in our value chain, in order to have the best possible result. I think if we take this direction, then we will not go into contradictions. What I'm very scared about, though, is that, as I was saying at the beginning, we're not going into this direction. We're not looking at the root causes of the problems that we have into our manufacturing, that we have into our automotive sector, that we have into our battery production, that we have into our the loss of our internal demand, which are much more complex problems than just an attack on Green Deal. Instead, what we're seeing now is that the solution for every problem is simplification, that actually looks like deregulation, attack on Green Deals, and attack on social and environmental conditions. And this is unacceptable because, first, it's something that we cannot afford for climate and social justice reasons, but it's also absolutely not going to the point, because it's not tackling the root causes of the problems, and it is creating contradictory policies because it's not done in a rational way. It's just done to make some part of our parliament happy, which are not really supported, their arguments are not really supported by scientific and empirical proofs. So in my opinion, what we need to do now is to understand the rationale, to understand the policies that were made last mandate, to support the policies that are working, to improve and understand what we need to change, if there's something that we need to change to improve the policies that are not working or that still have some problems, and most of all to support our workers, our internal demand and internal offer, and our manufacturing sectors in a fair value chain approach. I think if we don't do this, then you're completely right, we will end up in contradictory and harmful policies.
Thanks, Benedetta, and thank you so much for joining us as well. Giulia, as we see the car CO2 targets being questioned, now EU leaders next door at the European Council now calling the 2040 overall emissions reduction target into question. What kind of signal do you think this sends to the overall supply chain when you need the demand of electric vehicles to stimulate the raw material imports, right?
Absolutely, excellent question. So I think so generally it sends a very bad signal, and I want to expand on that. I mean, I do think that not just coordination among the Commission, but generally one common vision all across this value chain is missing. And it's easy to say, let's just put a Tsar in. By the way, I'll volunteer to be a Tsarine of raw materials when I come back from my maternity leave. I think it's a great job. But on a serious note, I would outline two things. So the first one indeed is that vision across all the value chain. And this is something we can really actually learn from China. So they said, they have these 5-year plans, right? They said, we want to lead in, for example, electric vehicles and batteries. And they put policies all across. They put policies on demand. So yes, indeed, car makers have to sell those vehicles and people buy them. By the way, all those think that there's no demand in Europe. Latest statistics, electric vehicle sales are through the roof in Europe in 2025. Forget about headlines last year. They're through the roof because affordable models entered the market. Why did they enter the market now? Because car makers have to sell them because of the 2025 target. This is the power of the standard. It brings mass market and therefore increases that volume. What that does, though, more of those sales create the business case for battery manufacturers. If we now start removing the CO2 standards, there is no certainty of offtake for battery manufacturers. So they're already struggling and they're already losing, some of the certainty on top, of course, of industrial policies that I mentioned. If we lose battery factories, the entire value chain is gone. And then maybe I slightly disagree with you, Mark. We won't have recycling because we don't need to wait for cars to come back in 12 years. Today, we can recycle a lot of scrap as battery factories scale up, for example. But if there's no battery factories, there's no scrap to recycle. So again, no capacity. You don't have battery factories, no one will be building components, cathodes, anodes here. Why would you do that? And then, even if you secured European raw materials, who will buy them? They have nowhere to go. So the entire value chain falls without having the market. And the market does come from vehicle CO2 standards for electric vehicles or renewable targets for renewables, for example. So this is number one, that value chain approach across policies, not only coordination of different raw material policies, which is already missing. But the second element I want to add to our discussion here that I think we're missing on coordination is the role of member states. It is not only people in the Commission that need to talk to each other and have policies right, because a lot of levers to implement, most notably money, lies at the member state level. State aid, for example. When I work, if I look more into the global dimension, I agree with lots of points Sarah made there, by the way, about CITIPs. But again, if we want to scale those global projects, who comes in? The export credit agencies of member states. So the money is in the member states. So without having that joint vision between the Commission and the member states, be it how the money is spent, be it how do we deal with foreign direct investment, right? So we say we want Chinese expertise and skills. Very good. But then Hungary goes and does whatever Hungary wants to do. And we're not getting anywhere. So that member state buy-in is really missing. And I would say it's even more important than breaking silos in the Commission, which I think slowly is actually happening.
Mark, what impact would you say that this policy uncertainty, for instance, around CO2 targets, has on the raw material sector?
Well, I think, Julia pointed it out. It has an impact on our industry. We see that different than other raw materials industries. In nickel, we have a significant production increase, especially in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. In the meantime, more than 60% of all nickel comes out of Indonesia. European production remained stable over the past years, but we shrinked in our relevance when it comes to global production. And there's one point of hope that I have when it comes to the European nickel producers, which is the sustainability aspect. So we have seen, for various reasons, that European nickel producers invested a lot into getting their carbon footprint down. They invested a lot into making their production more sustainable. And that is a competitive advantage that we see, hoping that other markets outside the European Union are also going to look into sustainability aspects, as this is what European industries make strong. And I agree, Julia, with you. Yes, when it comes to production scrap, they are significant. So that is indeed a major source for recycling input. Yes.
We have a lot of questions come in from the audience, so I think I'll go to those. But first, we have audience intervention from an online participant, which is Astrid Karamira. If we could put her up on the screen. So Astrid is the Sustainability and Governance Manager at the International Lithium Association, so we can get specifically the perspective of lithium here. Astrid, what's your thoughts on some of the issues we've been talking about here? You're muted, Astrid?
Yes, I really no, I just unmuted myself. Thank you very much, Dave, for the opportunity and for pulling me up. From what I understand, I think I have like a very short intervention, right? About 2 minutes. Is that correct?
Good.
Yeah?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, then I will just react a little bit. Basically, I'm very much in line, obviously, with what Mark has been saying and what Julia has been saying. Like, I mean, we all know and agree that critical raw materials such as lithium as well are very essential to Europe's future. And so we've seen that the Critical Raw Materials Act and also the EU Batteries Regulation, they recognize this by setting ambitious targets for refining and recycling within Europe. However, what we're seeing is that the European raw materials industry is facing a wall of unachievable regulation and uncertainty at the moment. We're seeing that investors are increasingly cautious to engage in mining, refining, or recycling projects in Europe. This has also been mentioned already by the panelists. And on top of that, like we see a fragmented chemicals policy, which is shifting regulatory interpretations and unpredictable timelines. And with all of that, investing in Europe is becoming just much more riskier than in other jurisdictions. For us in the lithium sphere, what is very important is that the proposed classification of lithium salts as category 1A or 1B reproductive toxicants by the European Chemicals Agency has triggered a big concern across the battery and raw material value chain. And within this, we see that several of the EU's key trading partners, including the ones Julia actually already mentioned in the beginning, Chile, Argentina, Australia, and the US, have disagreed with this classification, which, if it was adopted, risks adding even more complexity and uncertainty in a sector that is already heavily regulated. And all of this without any clear scientifically proven benefit for health or safety. So we think that such a decision weakens Europe's position in the global market, and it is also inconsistent with the CRMA's core objective, as well as it's also actually at odds with the Draghi Report, which was also mentioned earlier, the conclusions of the Draghi Report and the then subsequent Competitiveness Compass. So therefore, what we do actually, and what we want to do also with this, is we urge the European Commission to consider the importance of coherence between policies and regulations based on risk and science at the same time, in order to ensure a more protective and scientifically sound framework that is actually aligned with the EU's strategic objectives. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So now I'll take some questions from the audience. Again, you can put your questions in on Slido. I'll get them up here on the tablet. Let's stay with lithium. I will take a question first from Andrea Demasi from SQM Lithium. It's a question for Daniel. The question is, what can be expected from the upcoming battery booster to stimulate demand for battery materials?
Well, at this point, I can only say that our colleagues in DG Grow are working on the booster as announced. But so far, I don't have any further communication publicly that where this is going. So,
okay, so we'll see where that goes. Next question is to Sarah. The question is from Ignacio Guibert Suarez. Will the Greens support the Stop the Clock proposal on battery due diligence? is there a majority for it to pass in Parliament?
No, we won't support it. It's actually me negotiating, and we put a rejection amendment. I think it's really important if we want to create a viable ecosystem for batteries, that we also respect the standards that we've put in there when it comes to, for instance, environmental and social criteria. I think it's a very bad signal before some of these due diligence requirements are even in place. Just, I think it's a month before they are supposed to be applicated, just say, we changed our minds. I think that this creates a lot of investment insecurity, whilst I think what we really need is more predictability. And another problem that I have with the omnibus next to, the stop the clock principle, it's a bit the same as was said earlier on the CO2 targets. If you are now wavering from what you had decided not that long ago, I think it's really detrimental for the trust, for the investment security, and even if there are smaller things that the Commission wants to change, for instance, when it comes to mid-caps, I think you are opening Pandora's box, and that there will be a lot of chaos in the Parliament, as has been the case in other, I would say, omnibus proposals. So I think it's really not what we need right now. What we need is a clear vision of where we want to go. There's a lot that we can learn there, I think, from the Chinese. They have really created this ecosystem. It's very clear, it's closed loop, there's clear investment, they created a market for it. That's really what we should do. I don't want to be overcritical. There are some things where the Commission is indeed going in the right direction. For instance, I'm really looking forward to the proposal on corporate fleets, for instance, where I think it will be important to create demand and really to shape up that ecosystem. But I think we need to go further than that. For instance, thinking about something like local content requirements, it has been mentioned, made in Europe, really as a label. Perhaps there's a way to formulate it, for instance, resilience targets to make it more WTO compliant. And I think on the other hand, what is really also needed is more on, well, let's put it the trade side of things, but it's very intertwined, for instance, with the recent communication on state aids, where earlier von der Leyen had announced a sort of IRA-style support to our European battery manufacturers, and said that the EU would condition aid to Chinese giants and tech sharing and local supply chains, whilst we haven't seen any of that appear in the text as it was shared yesterday. And I mean, the example of Hungary has been given. I think it's really a missed opportunity. If we don't step it up, we really risk a solar scenario for our supply chains. If we don't make sure that we get our act straight, this is really a lost cause. And then the Chinese are just going to swoop in and take the entire market. So yeah, I don't think stop the clock is going to solve all of that issues. Quite the contrary.
Okay. Next question is from Mark. The question is from Carl Thies. What role do you see for the raw material platform that is going to be launched? Has there been a lot of interest signaled from companies?
I have to admit, I'm not familiar with the raw materials platform. Is it in the context of the Critical Raw Materials Act?
I think so. Maybe we can
Then
put Daniel.
That's maybe more for me then.
Sure.
So we are developing this joint purchasing platform, as announced last year, to match supply and demand. So we ideally will be looking at having an instrument that will link producers of raw materials with off-takers. And we see interest from various stakeholders, also from strategic projects that we have to be there. And we are looking at the end of the year to have this launched.
If I may, I would like to make a quick comment back to Sarah regarding the stop the clock. I think it is important to understand that from a raw materials producer perspective, you are facing various initiatives where you're requested to comply with due diligence requirements. And the challenge is that they are all differing from each other. And companies don't want to do the job 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. That's point number one. The second point is, especially when it comes to the batteries regulation, we don't know exactly what the requirements will look like. And there, the Commission was supposed to publish the so-called secondary legislation in February. That was actually right now postponed. To cut a long story short, I think there's a commitment from industry. We want to actually comply with ESG requirements. But this has to be done in the most efficient way. And we need to have clarity up front, what standard to be applied and how to be implemented. So it's not about, escaping from responsibilities, but doing things in the most efficient way. Again, we are competing on a global scale. And if we have to work on implementing standards 3, 4, 5 times, this is quite costly, and it's going to result in a loss of competitiveness.
Julia, you wanted to come in on this also.
Since we're having a debate about stop the clock, I'd also like to come in on stop the clock. I think it's a very big, interesting debate now in the Parliament. So first of all, I actually disagree that the due diligence requirements are all different. In both CSDDD and battery regulation, they've all been based on the United Nations or OECD due diligence guidelines. They're all pretty similar, pretty clear, and most companies in Europe know very well how to do this. So that's absolutely not the case. What I do understand, and I do agree, that writing the same report for 3 pieces of legislation 3 times is not necessary. And this is something we all agree on, and we can all, I think there's no problem agreeing. Let's not do reporting every year, let's not do it separate, let's do one set of reportings. This is simplification, and we all can support it. But what is happening right now is under the term of simplification, we are changing primary requirements of the law, reducing the amount of due diligence. That's very different. And I think we need to be transparent about that. That is not necessary. And here, I don't want to take over the audience for 10 minutes, but I would say what we are really missing is big picture. We are not better than the Chinese on technology. On carbon footprint, they can make it as well. On recycling, they're better. But the transparency in checking the supply chain is still something we do, or Western companies do, and they actually don't. And many European companies have already implemented it. In Europe, companies like Volvo Cars already do this. There are others. On the raw material side, we already have a standard. For example, IRMA, Initiative for Raw Materials Assurance, that already some companies apply. So we already do it. It's actually our competitive advantage. We require it now. We actually almost delay some of those Asian companies entering the market. And I think we're missing it because we want to save a bit of money and we don't like some regulations. That's a very short-term view, not understanding the competitive advantage we have in the West, which is ESG, as you, Mark, said earlier.
Did you want to respond, Mark? Quickly?
Well, I think given the time, I shouldn't respond. As
okay, we don't want to get
Julia
too
said it,
it's
a topic where you can spend hours and days discussing. There are different ways to, there are different standards that you can apply, different ways to achieve the target. I think the important point is, as industry, we don't want to escape from responsibilities, but it is actually implementing such a standard is very costly. It's not a minor cost, it's a major cost. And therefore, it is something where companies are concerned. And we also have to acknowledge, now I start talking, I shouldn't, but we also have to acknowledge there's this global dimension. So we need raw materials from abroad. And that means that our partners, for example, in Chile, in Argentina, in Indonesia, they need to comply with these requirements. And that is a challenge.
But they don't need to do it. It's not the small, tiny mine in Indonesia that needs to do it. The way due diligence works and the way the law works is that the big downstream company here would have a process to support them to do that. That is the whole point of due diligence. It's not a requirement on a small miner in a global country. It's a requirement on the company, big company with lots of power sourcing. And European companies do that already. That's why I mentioned Volvo Cars. There's also Mercedes, BMW. And actually what you do, and we didn't have time for that, but many people say sustainability. I think we need to move away from this generic theory of sustainability to practice. In practice, what does it mean? You work, for example, with a supplier in Indonesia to improve their water management system. That's what actually helps, not talking about it. And that's exactly the type of actions that battery due diligence would accelerate, which are not happening. It shouldn't be a paperwork report. It should be those actions.
So let's take another question from the audience. This question is for Daniel. It's from Michael Landmeters. And it actually has to do with the topic of these REACH restrictions that Mark was talking about before. So ECHA recommended that the Commission classify lithium salts as toxicants under REACH. This is expected to decrease lithium investments in the EU. How do you look at this recommendation and how will the Commission act on it?
Well, we take note of this first opinion of ECHA, that's one thing. Second thing is that any decision taken by the Commission will be based on scientific evidence. That's very clear for us. That's the second point. Next point, we are discussing further with the member states and all the stakeholders on this issue. And any decision by the Commission will be taken by the end of this year.
Okay. Next question is to Julia from Stella Bueller from the Renault Group. It's a question about trade. So what type of measure do you advocate for a European preference that does not contravene WTO rules?
Yes. So I'll tell you an anecdote because that's such an excellent European question. We were doing a workshop, a webinar on sustainable battery supply chains with Indonesian government. So Indonesia has local preference. By the way, I can name you so many countries. To be honest with you, South Africa has it, Brazil has it, India, Indonesia. We probably the only ones left as a regional bloc not having local preference, by the way. But so I was having this webinar and they were talking about indeed their local preference. And I asked them that question, asked the person, the head of EVs in Indonesian government, how do you do this so it's WTO compliant? And his smile was incredible. He said, what a European question. I mean, does WTO still means anything? I don't know. That's maybe a theoretical question. No, but to answer this seriously, what we understand today is how major economies do that, is that you do not apply European or local preference as access to your market. Indeed, that's illegal. So any product can access the market. But you can apply it to the various incentives and subsidies that you give. So for example, you can say, yes, an electric vehicle from China can be here, can be sold. But if you want to get an electric vehicle subsidy, then you can then attach, for example, local content. So same with subsidies to producing things. So that is the way that in many countries around the world went for. India is another example, and I think that's what Europe should also do as part of EDA legislation.
Okay, next question I'm going to put to Sarah. This question is from Megan Richards. Reducing dependency can be addressed by increasing domestic production, but also by expanding and diversifying trade in critical raw materials. How can member states be encouraged to ratify EU trade arrangements that are advantageous to this trade? And I imagine that is a reference to Mercosur. Sarah, how would you respond to that?
Well, on the one hand, indeed, domestic production, we haven't talked about it a lot. I agree. I don't want to say that we are as naive as thinking that we are actually going to meet our future demand targets just based on recycling. I know that that is impossible and that that is a question of years. That's, of course, why, for instance, in the battery regulation, there's a really clear growth path to make sure that the recycled content targets are actually feasible. When it comes to trade, I don't believe that an FTA is the most efficient way, let's put it that way, to come to this diversification of our supply chain, because I'm sure that you're all aware that the time it takes to actually negotiate a fully fledged FTA is way too long, and we don't have this kind of time. That's why, the fact that there is now the instrument of having a sort of win-win partnerships with the Clean Trade and Investment Partnership, I think is a better way to go, instead of just relying on a fully fledged FTA. That's, well, we've seen in the previous term not a lot of movement. I used to be member of the Trade Committee in the European Parliament. I was negotiating, for instance, on a New Zealand deal, also on Australia, where at a certain point it seemed like the Commission was hoping to have a fast deal. Well, guess what? It didn't materialize. So yeah, that would be my answer. I think you need to be more pragmatic, and that it's smarter to, for instance, use these clean trade and investment partnerships than go for a fully fledged FTA.
Great, thanks. Another interesting question that's come in from Megan Richards. I'll put it to Mark. I'm not sure if this has relevance to nickel, but so the question is, does the USA-Ukraine agreement on critical raw materials limit the possibilities for EU interests there? So that potential source of critical raw materials, is that closed off by the US agreement?
I don't know. I don't know, to be honest. I mean, it's focusing on rare earth elements, I think, predominantly. I have no thoughts on it.
Anyone on the panel want to take that? I was thinking.
I think that's just quite a good example of, us talking, US doing. If I'm totally honest with you, I'm not supporting policies of who's behind the agreement, but there's just a clear action there. But I do think that there's a lot of things that we can and should be doing with Ukraine. For example, accelerating the access to the EU, for example, that can give Europe a much bigger role into what's happening with Ukrainian raw materials. We should just be there. We should be part of the table. We shouldn't just let the US get on with it.
Maybe I can add something, as I think on rare earth elements, it is a very specific situation, as we have a geopolitical concentration of a few deposits in certain regions globally. And it's something where you really have to look into the raw material that you are interested in. For nickel, for cobalt, for lithium, the situation is different, where you have a far wider spread. So it really depends on the raw material. For rare earth elements, that might have an impact. I think for nickel, it's not relevant.
Maybe to complement on my side from the Commission, actually, we do have a strategic partnership on raw materials with Ukraine, signed a few years ago. The second strategic partnership we ever signed. The first one was Canada, the second was Ukraine, that's one point. Secondly, we do have a strategic project in Ukraine with graphite, so just announced 4th of June, so there is ongoing activities on raw materials with Ukraine from the EU side.
So related to that, what you just said, Daniel, about strategic projects, a question from Tito Kopri, who is from Suez. What are the practical implications and benefits of being designated as a strategic project?
So practically, from the Act, you have the permitting periods that I already mentioned. So for extraction, 27 months, and processing, recycling, 15. That's one thing. Secondly, we have a subgroup on finance under the Critical Raw Materials Board, where we gather financial institutions, public and private entities, where we are working with them together on seeing how these financial institutions could potentially invest in these strategic projects. Yeah, so there are possibilities that we don't have directly funding for raw materials coming from being a strategic project from the EU side at the moment. So this subgroup on finance with the various institutions there, it's a tool that we are developing for having the financial situation and the support.
Okay, Mark, next question is for you. It's from Jakob Winkler. What is the point of establishing a premium market for raw materials?
who, as an industry association, talking about premiums is a challenge. I think, there's a trend that we can see right now, a discussion arising around, I'm producing my raw material with a very nice carbon footprint. I'm complying with ESG regulation. So shouldn't I get, more paid? I think we have to bring it back to the principles, which is it should be a requirement for everyone. And the fact is that most of the companies that already comply with these standards, with ESG standards or have a low carbon footprint, they internalize these costs. So I would rather see it from the angle that others have to follow. They have to take this step to actually get to the same level where others are already.
Okay. Next question is to Daniel. It's from Xavier Guillard. Is DG Grow coordinating with the JRC about the ongoing Sevilla process for battery manufacturing? Contaminants in recycled materials mean new risk profiles and maybe new industrial practices.
Well, we do cooperate with other services, including with the GRC on raw materials. So indeed, we work with the colleagues there in GRC.
Okay. Let's do a quick closing question. So to each of you, let me put this question you can answer in about 30 seconds or so. When we're looking ahead, so we have the CRMA on the books. We are where we are in terms of the focus on climate here in the EU at the moment. What do you think is the most important thing that will get us to a point, let's say in 10 years, a longer term time frame, where the EU is secure in its raw materials supply? Mark, I'll start with you.
Maybe you can start with Daniel, so I can think about it.
Do you have a single most important thing ready to go?
Well, we hear most often is access to finance. For the strategic projects in the EU, we need 22.5 billion. And for those with the third countries, we need 5.5, if I remember correctly. So around 40 billion euros needed for these 60 projects on raw materials. So I think access to finance is the key.
Okay. Julia, most important?
Yes, most important is to match now these frameworks like CRMA with industrial policy, which would be finance and local preference as a priority.
So now I thought about it. I think, and it's matching also with what Astrid said. And it might be funny for the participants to hear that, but for the raw materials industry in Europe, we are facing problems, challenges with chemicals management regulation. And looking forward, it would be nice to see that we get these things sorted out.
And finally, Sarah, what would you say is the most important thing to get us to a secure place in 10 years?
In 30 seconds, demand reduction, financing, good and stable regulation, and good and stable trade partnerships.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists for some really interesting thoughts. I think clearly one definite thing that came out of this panel is that there's a variety of EU policies affecting this area, and they all kind of have to work together. And if we have inconsistency between different areas, it can definitely send market signals for companies that want to invest in recovery or mining or all of the things that we need to get a more secure raw material supply. So definitely, it's given us a lot to think about and to talk about as we exit. And you can help yourself to some refreshments outside if you're here in the room. How about a round of applause for our excellent panelists? And so thank you to those of you online who joined us remotely. I wish you an excellent rest of your afternoon. And to those of you in the room, I invite you out to the reception. Take care.